So for those who don't know me, my name is Ketal. I work here with the Hoffman Institute, and we are trying to push for sustainability to be part of what INSEAD does. So that's our drive for change we're trying to make in a larger system, which is the one of higher education. Thinking that that's really important if we want to change organization, if we want to make progress toward the sustainable development goals, we need to change management education. So that's what we do here. We are delighted to welcome all of you as part of this SDG week. It's our third event today. Thanks for those who came to several of them. It's good to see you here. We're going to be talking about system change during this session. I'm delighted to welcome the two authors of this book. You can see it somewhere properly, but anyway, you can see the book. These two authors are Cynthia Rayner and François Bonici. They will be the main speakers. Cynthia is an alumna of INSEAD. Welcome home. She's an MBA 07. She is, and you're currently still a researcher and a lecturer, right? Associated to the University of Cape Town with the Bertha Center for Social Innovation. You've worked, so I don't know if you worked in or advised many nonprofit impact organizations, so you know what it takes to push for social innovation and social change. You bring that perspective. And I guess you've met François at the Bertha Center for Social, I'm assuming based on your bio. So François, you're a medical doctor by training. You've practiced as a doctor, including in humanitarian context. And you moved to social innovation from there to found the Bertha Center at the University of Cape Town. And you were also an adjunct professor there. Yes. So he knows business school and education and how hard it is to change things there. Right now, François leads social innovation at the World Economic Forum. And he is the director, I think we said director, of the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship. We are very happy to have you here. I was very excited to read these books because I've worked for NGOs, for governments, for the UN, and now for a business school. And I think it's a good read in terms of what you need, in terms of frame of mind and practices to push change in these different areas. So I think it applies for many people who want to be involved in pushing social change. So thank you for being here. And before I give you the floor, I wanted to give the floor to someone very special at INSEAD also. And this is Professor Subi Rangan. Please take a minute also, Subi, to welcome our guest. For those of you who don't know Professor Rangan, he is one of the champions of change for progress, as well as performance together on the issues of business and society at INSEAD, teaching them in MBA classes or in executive education. Also I think it's in 2013 that you created the Society for Progress, honoring fellows from philosopher to CEO leaders to also, I think, head in the public sector who are marrying performance and progress in their organization. And it's a fabulous group of change makers around the world. So I just thought, as you are thinking of the future of capitalism, how we bring progress together, to give you the floor for a few minutes before we pass on to our guests. Thanks.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Subi Rangan. I'm a professor here in the strategy department, been at INSEAD for 26 years now. It's a very long time. And this evening, we have a fabulous topic, great speakers, and a great platform. So in terms of the topic, sometimes I think about humanity, 7.5 billion people, and we're all on this airplane. And I ask myself, this is a huge airplane, and we want to fly far, fly high, not so much turbulence. How many engines should this airplane have? What do you think? A big airplane carrying 7.5 billion people. What would be an ideal design number of engines for this airplane? How many engines do big airplanes have? 4. 4 would be, a reasonable number. What we really have is 2 engines. And one of them is government, the other is business. These are the two main engines on which we depend. And we know both of these, are important. So we have schools of government, we have schools of business, but there are two other engines. One of them is community and the other is family. We need four engines. And the work that they're going to talk about is about one of these engines, community, which is so invisible yet so vital if we are going to go far on this airplane. And so I'm looking forward very much. And I think we don't have, as far as I know, schools of community. But without community, we're not going to go very far in addressing vital issues from crime, mental health. It's just incredible once you start thinking about it. And people have written about it, but not as thoughtfully with, feet on the ground. And so I'm really looking forward to this. Now, as for the authors, I just had a chance to meet Cynthia. So welcome back. And she's working on her PhD and almost done. So this is going to be more output working on this topic where we need more knowledge and better understanding of the theory. There's a lot of practice, but not a lot of good theory. So really, congratulations. And I do know Francois is a dear friend. Francois works at the World Economic Forum, and I know the World Economic Forum for some years now. And if I were to think of the top 5 people in the World Economic Forum who are intellectually engaged, Klaus Schwab and Hilda Schwab, when they founded the forum more than 50 years ago, they have directors. And if I think of the top 5 list on people who are intellectually engaged, have domain expertise, Francois would be on that top 5 list. If I think of people at the forum who lead, because it's also an organization, and it's not just a think tank, and they do a lot of things, including engaging internally and externally. If I think of leaders, people who can lead other human beings and achieve amazing things, top 5 list, Francois would also be on that list at the World Economic Forum. And he would be the only one on both lists. Oh. Francois is just exceptional. I serve on the board of the Schwab Foundation with him. I've seen how in the last just couple of years since he's taken over, it's just an extraordinary evolution. So I'm really very honored that both of you are here at our school. Thirdly, about the platform, INSEAD is an amazing platform. You know that, and I think our school, particularly now with the Hoffman Institute, and our notion that the world could be a place where if we each do our little part with humility and not worry about solving the problem, but just doing our part, I think would be a better place. And of course, without connections, we can't do this. And that's what our speakers are going to speak about. I have my copy of the book and I'm looking forward to the signing and the dinner with you afterwards. Thank you and welcome back.
Thank you very much. For people online, you ask your question in the chat and we'll pick them up from here. And for those here, you just raise your hand. And then there'll be book signing after. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you. Well, Francois said that I had to start because this is my alma mater. So I have to say I'm more used to being in your seats than standing up here. A bit nerve-wracking, actually. But what I would like to do is just first thank Patel and thank the Hoffman Institute for inviting us to be here today. It's absolutely a pleasure to be back on campus and to be with you. Thank you to Anna for helping us get here so smoothly. That's really appreciated. Anna made sure that everything happened so smoothly to get us here today. And thank you so much, Subi, for that wonderful introduction. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be here. So we're just going to actually be taking you on a bit of a journey. I promise I didn't send these slides to Subi ahead of time. So the image of the plane taking off and the fact that we were going to be talking about a journey just kind of fits so perfectly here. But we have about 35 minutes or so to walk you through this. And then we would really like to spend time in questions because we think that's really important to be able to engage with the conversation here about what we're talking about. We're going to be talking about a journey of how we got to meet a number of different organizations that are doing what we came to call systems work, really engaging in changing systems, but doing the work of every day. We're going to be talking about our personal journey to actually meet these organizations. We'll be talking about what we learned from those organizations. We'll be deep diving into an organization called Buurtzorg, which we think is very emblematic of this work and based here in Europe. And then we're going to go a little bit broad and talk about where do we go from here? Why is this work relevant for the SDGs? Why do we think that even these small stories actually have relevance for the big work that we need to do in the world? So I'm first going to hand it over to Francois to tell his personal journey. And then I'll take it over and talk about my journey from this school here.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you all for coming this evening. I will not repeat the thanks in too many words, but Anna, Subi, it's not often I actually get moved before standing up, and so Subi, I will now make sure that I up your retainer for public relations. Subi was also very kind in reviewing the book and endorsement, so thank you. Cynthia normally says I warm her up, so let's see if we can get warmed up. I think we both were quite frustrated with the careers we had. Mine was as a medical doctor, recognizing in the systems I was working in, public health systems, private health systems, that we were not really getting to the root of the problems of iron. Some of the cases we kept seeing over and over again, and the systems we built were not necessarily serving in the ways that, idealistically I'd hoped to become a doctor and do public health. But what I'd also spent time doing, and Ethel mentioned it, was working in humanitarian settings and had worked, for development agencies, worked in private sector, started to see, I think like many of us, coming to a point where we felt, well, actually this plane we're on is stalling, right, in many ways. And I think it's kind of become a global realization. In my own sense, I'd worked extensively around social change beyond health, started looking at poverty alleviation, education systems, and other types of initiatives, and recognized actually our own failures. We had started the Center for Social Innovation in a country of South Africa. So some of you who know the history of South Africa know that the problems we were trying to develop solutions to had this very long backstory, right? And that many of the reasons why some of these problems exist, had very long historical roots. And that by solving the problems in front of us, we were not necessarily getting to the reason why these problems existed in the first place. And so we felt stuck. We felt failures in our work much of the time. We also felt we were just scratching the surface. And so part of how we came to this was recognizing there was this conversation emerging in the world around the fact that we don't only need climate change and social change, we actually need to change some of the systems, right? But the frustration was, what the hell do people mean when they talk about systems change, right? Sometimes we say, oh, it's something, ideological that we want, in the future, 50 years from now, this is how we want the world to look. Okay, but how do we get there? Or actually, systems are changing all the time. Well, what does that look like? How do we start to influence it? And so kind of our journey got to the point of saying there was something happening in the global conversation that was being driven a little bit by global North actors around the changes, often in emerging economies, often in excluded communities, that was somehow disconnected from what we were seeing on the ground. Anyway, that's a bit of my story. I've ended up now, as you said, kind of at the World Economic Forum, and with the Schwab Foundation, many of the organizations we studied are part of our network at the Schwab Foundation, and sitting at this really interesting nexus point of the world getting together, business getting together with governments, with civil society, saying this is the change we want to see. Here are the SDGs we're working towards, but recognizing, the Social Progress Index did the study saying we're probably 60 years behind schedule that will meet the SDGs if we carry on the current trajectory by 2092, right? Okay, so clearly we need to be doing things differently. Clearly technological innovation is going to be a really important part of that, but it's not the only part. It's around how we organize together around, building those other engines that they can work in unison. And so, for us, this journey, and that we're going to start sharing now is a little bit around, well, how do organizations start to do this deeper work? How can we think a little more about not only trying to solve the problems directly in front of us, but actually creating the systems that can actually allow everyone to be part of those solutions. So we'll dive more into it. I'll stop there. Cynthia, hopefully I've warmed up.
Thank you. Perfect. Well, my journey starts right here in this, well, not this amphi, actually the one right next door.
You were born here?
My journey for the book. And so I came to INSEAD after working as a management consultant. I probably have a similar background to many of you. And I came to INSEAD with the seed of an idea that I wanted to work in social change. I didn't know what exactly to call it at that time. I didn't know exactly what form it would take, but I knew that I wanted to have my life and my work have some sort of impact in a positive way on the world around me. As a management consultant, I felt I had had lots of tools in business, but coming to the MBA program felt like I was going to get a broader exposure to what those tools could be. Well, fast forward 10 months, and then I found myself in a position of, okay, what do I do? And my immediate reaction was to go to work in the nonprofit sector. I worked as a fundraiser. I went straight from INSEAD into a fundraising role. Not a good idea from a financial standpoint, but a very good idea from learning what it means to work in a nonprofit. But what I realized was that from New York City, trying to impact the world through fundraising, I wasn't really getting a sense of what was working. So I actually joined a fellowship called the LGT Venture Philanthropy Fellowship. It took me to South Africa, where I worked for an organization called Mothers to Mothers, an organization that's profiled in the book. And I spent 3 years with them learning how to scale social innovations. So I'm using these terms because these were the terms that I learned were really important to having an impact in the world. And the more I got into it, the more I thought, in fact, this is actually what I wanted to do. A couple of years into it, I started to get a little bit worried. I started to realize that a lot of the work that we were doing was creating parallel systems, that we were actually working as an antidote to what government was trying to achieve, that we were bringing in private funds from the global north and trying to actually make change, but largely driven by agendas that were outside of the countries in which we were operating. And I started to get really frustrated with the way that the system was working. I then decided, well, let's go closer to the ground. Maybe I can get a little bit more impact if I can actually get a little bit more granular in my work. So I started working in a township outside of Cape Town, working in an after-school program for children living with HIV. I was their program director, and I can tell you that this was a moment of true clarity. I realized that by being that close to the ground, that the work that I was doing of bringing funds in from USAID and from other institutional actors in the global north and trying to create change, me as a white American woman in a township community, an underprivileged community in South Africa, was actually exactly the opposite of the change that was needed. And I got really scared and I got really nervous, and I realized that in fact, all of the training that I had gone through in order to lead me up to this point couldn't prepare me for what I was learning right then, which was that the communities that were actually the kind of object, I saw them as an object of my change efforts, were in fact being disempowered from driving the change that they needed in their own lives. And I backed up. I got completely out of it and I said, I've got to go somewhere else. And fortunately, Francois was able to welcome me to the Bertha Center, where I was able to do research, where I was able to think about, well, what would be the other alternative? What would be the alternatives to that type of work, to that very prescriptive work that in fact was disempowering communities? And we went on a real journey to discover what that work could be. And the result is the book that we're talking about today. We went to organizations. Yes.
I'm just thinking about like the global world vision that is implementing, right, community-based humanitarian action, but they have been around for like decades and are quite huge. So doesn't this exist already?
I think let's get into it, and you can tell me. You can tell me if it's the same as what you see World Vision doing. I think it's quite different, but you can tell me when we get into it if you think it's different or the same.
All right.
So we went on a journey to visit many organizations across the world, organizations that were saying that they were changing systems, and we spent time with them. The result is the work that we're going to talk about with you today, to really think about how do organizations assist communities to drive their own change. But first, we want to back up a little bit and talk about why is it so hard to affect social change? What is it about the problems that we are trying to solve that makes it really difficult to create social change that is lasting, that is contextual, and that really serves the people in the world in this 7.5 billion person airplane that we are a part of. This is basically describing what I just went through. So go ahead, Francois.
So you were asking, how does it, why is it so difficult to change? So maybe one or two people can tell me what they see. What do you see?
Unfinished fence.
An unfinished fence?
Something absurd. Something that is absurd
Something that is absurd? Okay, why is it absurd?
because it does not protect it, like when it's supposed to.
Okay,
If you ask what we see, we focus on the gate, but there is absolutely nothing that prevents you to go on the side. So you focus on the thing that you want me to see, but actually everything else is possible.
what else is interesting behind that gate?
There is a wall.
There's a wall. What's between the wall and that? Maybe it's not that obvious on the screen. It's more obvious on that screen. Can you see it?
Right?
There's a path.
Sometimes
Yeah. Okay, so what's interesting about the fact that the gate is there, but the path looks like, there's no fence, but the path looks like it's quite worn.
Despite the fence,
Yeah.
there is a path that people
Yeah.
keep going.
So what's happening? People are still walking on the path.
Force of the habit. You have to go through the gate. So you don't even think why you go through the gate. It's just because it has always been like this, like the thing that we hear all the time. We hear all the time.
Exactly.
It has always
We
been
go through the gate because everyone else must be going through the gate, and we've always gone through the gate. And maybe there's a historical reason. Maybe there was a fence there, but that fence isn't there anymore, but we keep walking on that gate. Maybe there are things unseen, and maybe there are landmines we don't really know, but so we fear, right? So it is an absurd picture, but thank you for entertaining me. I think the point is that by human nature, there are many reasons why we're resistant to change. Fear, habit, social norms, right? And this is a very small picture, and we have suddenly this plane we're on, right? And we're, at times we're on this huge, large industry we built around how the world works. And there are many, many barriers in place towards kind of why human nature is difficult to change. I mean, you can go into the theory of all this, the social construction of reality and all of the ways around human behavior. But I think the important thing is that systems that exist have some very long historical roots, some of which may not exist today. There are a whole bunch of written rules and unwritten rules, right? And that they're, systems in general are very difficult to shift and change. And so when we talk about things, let's just change systems, we're all entrenched in patterns and that are quite difficult to shift. So when we start talking about kind of systems change, we need to think about, well, what are the things we see that are visible and what are the things that perhaps are less visible?
And this is a framing that we actually found very instructive because it kind of breaks down what systems change can look like in 3 levels of activities. So that top level is often where we focus a lot of our efforts on. These are on the conditions that are at the very explicit level. So these are things that are policies, they're practices, they're resource flows. These are the things that are the changes in funding, the technologies, the apps, the things that actually enable us to do some of the change efforts. But what we realize is that oftentimes we can put these efforts out into the world, we can put these structural changes out into the world, and oftentimes they're not taken up. So I saw that a lot in my work, was that oftentimes you could say, well, this is the best thing for you, but oftentimes that wasn't the actual change that was going to seed itself deeply in a community. The second level here goes a little bit further. So sometimes when we can change these efforts, these relationships and connection, the power dynamics, oftentimes then we can start to see that real durable change is happening. But then oftentimes you'll see that change will kind of fall back on itself, that in fact, some of these things, the power dynamics, we can make some efforts. We can make some efforts in equality. We can make some efforts in gender. We can make some efforts in the ways that people relate to one another. And then it just kind of reverts back. I think we've seen a lot of that over the last couple of years. And so really what Francois was talking about is truly these mental models, the things that drive us to go straight through that gate, down the path that everyone has already taken, because we are so ingrained in our way of thinking that we cannot even imagine change. And if we truly want to create systemic change, we need to be looking at all of these different levels and ultimately try and create the change that is going to create that deeper level change. Just getting a little bit further into the social challenges, why might the social challenges that we are facing, and these are very much the types of challenges that we seek to change when we talk about the SDGs. Why are they so difficult to change? Why do they require those 3 levels of change? It's because they have 3 features, and we go through this in the first couple of chapters of the book, trying to really analyze why was it that the problems that we were seeking to solve were so intractable. That's the word that many people in the sector use. They say these problems are intractable. And we realize that it really comes down to 3 different features. The first is complexity. The second is that they are large scale. And the third is that they are deep, really the piece that Francois was talking about the depth of social issues. And just talking a little bit about complexity. When we talk about complexity, this is just a little bit of thinking in systems as to why do complex problems show up differently than the technical problems that we are often trained to solve in our business classes, in our standard school classes. It's partly because when we talk about complexity, we're talking about everything being interlinked. So once you go into one aspect of the problem, it turns up over here as being related. That oftentimes we can all get together and we can say that we're trying to solve the same problem, but our formulation of that problem is completely different. So your idea of a solution is going to be different than my idea of a solution. There's no endpoint to these problems. So once you solve one thing, there's more to solve. And every context is different. So even though we can say this worked in one place, we poured it over here and we tried it another place and it tosses up unintended consequences. So although it's a best practice, over here it doesn't work. Why is that? It means that solutions are not just true and false, like that's the perfect one and that's the one that's no good. In fact, it's that this one is good in this context, this one is poor, but we can improve upon it. So things are not binary. They're not the good and the bad. They're actually something that we can improve upon. We always have to constantly learn. What do we mean by large scale? I think scale is an interesting one because in business school, I was taught that scale meant economies of scale. I was taught about what it means when you replicate a program and how you can ensure that costs are lower when you do that. But when we started studying this more deeply, we realized that there's scale in terms of the economic implications, but there's also scale in just how does a system change when you put something bigger through it? When you're actually trying to solve a bigger problem with the same solution, what changes? And we don't actually have a good understanding of how scale works in complex adaptive systems. We're very good in factories and in manufacturing scenarios of saying, okay, I can do this and I can do it 100 times and I can reduce the costs. When we try to do that in a city with people in unique contexts, we're not very good at understanding what will happen. And in each context, it changes how scale actually impacts the way a system responds. And then lastly, what do we mean by depth? Well, these are the things that we've been talking about in terms of our mental models. There are the things that are the deeply held beliefs, the values, the assumptions, the things that we go into a situation thinking of as, this is just the way it is. It can't be changed. In fact, this is the thing that I believe and I'm not going to change. And these systems really fail us when we can't change them because we can't even imagine how they could change. I think the big one here is that we are part of the systems we are trying to change. So when I was operating in a context that was not my own, I didn't realize that I wasn't someone coming in from the outside and able to manipulate variables like on a spreadsheet. I was actually someone who was becoming part of the system and I was changing the system as I was operating in it. Even worse, I was coming in with my modes of beliefs and my values and imposing them upon others. And in fact, that wasn't helping the system evolve to be what it needed to be. Okay, we're going to now get into the crux of the book, of what we learned from the organizations that we studied. And I'm going to hand it over to Francois.
So just one quick, observation, I think, from where I am now at the World Economic Forum. And one is, we're seeing these massive transitions towards a green economy. We're seeing big transitions towards the digital economy. So we are actually having systems change. We're working on these big complex problems. We're working towards the SDG. But who's working on them? And who's going to benefit from a new green economy? Look at who's setting the rules, who's investing it, who's developing the new tech, who's buying it up, right? So who benefits from our current system is probably not going to change very much, even if we have a newer system that is perhaps a greener system. And so that's a critical piece of the SDG is the inclusion dimension, right? And I think we wanted to focus on that as part of this depth conversation that, we are going to have changes in systems, but unless actually people are at the core of it, we're going to be leaving out more than half of that plane, right? And that's actually going to hamper the efforts of the entire civilization. So the kind of core question that I think we wanted to emphasize in this work was really around who's driving change, right? And who should drive change. And ultimately, we kind of went on this journey. We interviewed more than 150 people, 8 deep dive case studies, these organizations we work with, and looked at how their work was actually having, these kinds of systemic impacts that we'll talk about. But what was kind of consistent across many of them was who was actually driving. And this was a massive shift for me. I mean, maybe you've spoken about World Vision, they have community programs. And I think for years in development and UN institutions, we've had participatory processes. We've had ways of including community. But there has not really been in those processes ways where we've actually given over power, right? Where actually communities are making the actual decisions around kind of what the program properly looks like, what decisions are made. Maybe they're consulted in the process. Maybe there are some, great programs. But I think what we were really looking for and what really emerged from this research was this question about primary actors. The people are actually living what we call kind of the greatest point of complexity in the system. So that sounds very academic, but if you think about in an education system, what's the greatest point of complexity? That's between a child and the teacher, right? In terms of all of those other dynamics happening in that education system from, the Ministry of Education, right, to the principal, to the curriculum, to all of the things that make up an education system, the actual greatest point of complexity of where the most amount of dynamics are is actually in that relationship, right? And those kind of that core node and the people involved in that are the least able to actually influence what an education system looks like. And so we started to look at the kinds of organizations across many different fields that were looking at positioning these primary actors as really important decision makers in how the system could change. And so ultimately this work and kind of the change, I think, in our own mindset is that whether it's a program or organization seeking to do social changes isn't about delivering a product and service that can improve the conditions of their lives. It was really about creating responsive and representative systems that can, in an ongoing way, seek to address challenges as they emerge. And that was through 3 principles that we saw across all these organizations. So fostering connection, which was really about building collective identity between people to stay together while continuing to learn. Embracing context. So that's really what Cynthia was talking about, that something may work in one. And we've seen this in many times. Okay, here's a great program that works, let's replicate it across the world. And when you do that, you realize that's not working for a whole bunch of reasons. And often the work that then gets done in that context by the person who's responsible for rolling it out, they suddenly have to do all this other highly relational work to understand and to shift things to the context. So embracing context really encourages this plurality of solutions. We need different kinds of solutions in different contexts that continue to meet needs as they emerge, as they evolve. And then, of course, we haven't spoken sufficiently, but we'll start to speak a lot more about power, right? that ultimately we need to ensure that these primary actors are in positions of decision-making, of authority, and how do we build the tactics, the strategies to actually do that kind of work so that people have a greater say and that actually our initiatives, our programs around social change are not about delivering services, but about building agency, about building capacity for change, right? And really thinking about that being the long-term trajectory around building the system. So those three principles, and then we kind of look at the actual organizational practices and tactics in all of these organizations, and we'll talk a bit about some of them later on, and we'll speak about one case in particular, but really look at this. And you spoke about those four engines and this third engine, community. If you think about those first two engines, business and government, there's considerable consolidated power, right, and resources in both of those. And community is very fragmented, right? So the building of collectives is one way of starting to build a common identity and common power to start to address, how do we bring the voice of people who have been excluded for a whole bunch of reasons. We'll talk about equipping problem solvers, right, which is really about them providing the ability for people to solve their own problems, promoting platforms, which again provides an opportunity for people to come together and have platforms of power, and disrupting the policies and patterns that exist that we saw, in the gate or in the higher level policy changes that we want. Cynthia, you want to add on to that?
No, what I'd like to do is have a deep dive into the one case study, because I think that's going to help bring these practices to life. So I don't know if you had a chance to read the case study of Buurtzorg, but if you have, we're going to have some questions for you. But just to get everyone on the same page, we're going to do a quick video of their work.
In 2006, Jos de Blok, Gonnie Kronenberg and Art Leverink founded Buurtzorg, the Dutch home care nursing provider. They had become frustrated working in traditional home care settings where command and control screwed up the delivery of optimal care. The group set out to prove that an alternative management model based on freedom, trust, and autonomy would benefit everyone, including the patients. Starting out with just 4 nurses, they were determined to revolutionize their industry. And that is exactly what happened. The organization has grown exponentially and currently employs 11,000 nurses. By the way, there are no planning, HR, or marketing departments at Buurtzorg, and not a single manager to be seen. So how does all this work? Let's take a look. Buurtzorg's purpose is to help people live meaningful, autonomous lives. Everything they do is focused on that specific purpose. Their 3 guiding principles provide guidelines on how to move towards that purpose. Humanity above bureaucracy. Simplicity above complexity. And practical above hypothetical. These principles are woven into the fabric of the organization. Contrary to common practice, Buurtzorg decided not to grow a traditional hierarchy. Instead, it chose to create a network of self-managing teams. Every time a team grows to 12 nurses, they split. The 2 newly formed teams grow until they too reach that magic number and split again. This allows exponential growth without adding thick layers of bureaucracy. The nursing teams are each responsible for a specific neighborhood. They do all the necessary work, such as nursing, planning, personal development, recruitment, and the hiring and firing. Nowadays, there are around 900 self-managed teams, each enjoying a great deal of autonomy. The headquarters that supports this network of teams consists of only 50 people. This represents just 0.4% of the total workforce. Besides the support staff, there's a group of 20 coaches and a top leadership team of 2 directors. The coaches support the teams by helping with problems they cannot solve themselves. But Buurtzorg's teams are more than just a sum of their parts. A self-developed IT system, Buurtzorg Web, connects them. Their intranet allows teams to share knowledge, compare performance, and create alignment. For example, if nurses encounter unfamiliar situations, they use Buurtzorg Web to get advice from more experienced colleagues. Often, an answer arrives within hours. This also allows CEO Jos de Blok to communicate with everybody at lightning speed. He writes blog posts to instantly inform all colleagues of what's on his mind and invites their advice too. Through this radical form of self-management, Buurtzorg outperforms the competition when judged against almost any relevant metric you can think of. Buurtzorg enjoys the highest client satisfaction rating of any home care nursing organization in the Netherlands. Staff absenteeism is 33% lower than elsewhere, while staff turnover is half that of its peers. Overhead costs are 67% lower, and even more astonishing, Buurtzorg cures patients faster than its competitors. It's no surprise that more and more organizations are adopting the Buurtzorg principles. Buurtzorg shows the way towards more human, better motivated, and truly impactful work. Thus, providing scale without hierarchy, alignment without bureaucracy, and autonomy without anarchy. Learn more at corporate-rebels.com.
I'll just get started while you do slides. They gave you a bit of a taste of, okay, well, how does an organization set up to do that, more contextual work, right? And what you saw was a very different management structure, and maybe we're in a management school, so happy to discuss that part as well. But perhaps maybe just get started with, many of you now live in France. We can talk about the healthcare systems, but what are you seeing around healthcare systems around the world, in particular with aging populations? How are they not working, right? What problem is this looking to solve?
Compared to the amount of people who are unfortunately conditions. So the number of people who are there to subsidize their pensions as well as to pay for the costs of living is just, it's getting to a point that it's no longer sustainable.
The systems we've set up obviously to kind of serve that is now facing a very different both volume and economic challenge.
We don't have enough people.
Anything else?
Yeah, so basically the systems are operated by quite a large bureaucracy, which makes the overall thing quite unwieldy, quite expensive, and you just see a lot of kind of the ends consumers, if you will, patients in this case, just slipping through cracks. So people waiting long, like basically having long waiting times before they can actually get the care that they need, or if they get it basically very much dehumanized. So leaving a quite bad experience.
We've probably all been there at some point. And you're from the Netherlands, so maybe you know this case.
No, so what struck me was you talked about this primary actor node, the point of maximum complexity.
Yeah.
And usually healthcare systems seem to be so doctor-centric. No disrespect meant to doctors.
I was taught by nurses. Yeah.
But this seems nurse-centric and patient-centric, and that seems to be magical. It's less costly, and it's care coming home as opposed to going to some centralized place.
If I may, in France, it's an area that has been privatized, and with it came major scandals recently in terms of how they were not caring for patients the proper way, just trying to make money and save costs by feeding them less, changing them less, cleaning them less, etc. So that's a big
saw during
moment
the pandemic as well. Obviously, part of those challenges were suddenly brought to the fore. right? With care homes being, hugely exposed and
I think also one of the things is that it's becoming more and more removed. So you're taking you're taking people who are infirm and old, who are losing touch with their loved ones by virtue of being removed from their
Yeah.
home setting.
Yeah.
And as a result, there's no hotline that they can call. Or even if there was, I don't know if they would be physically capable, mentally capable of making that call and asking for help. And so it's very vulnerable. And what happened in France, my understanding was that there was just no way for them to know and no way for us to know.
Yeah.
And that's part of the horror of it.
so what's different here? Subi, you started to refer to it, that this is obviously nurse-based, but how does it position, nurses as problem solvers? And I mean, I know this from having worked on the front lines and worked with nurses. When you're there, you just have to implement the protocol that you were given, right? And deviating from that protocol actually puts you in a position of liability. So the fear you have also in doing what, you've been, instructed to do. So
It goes back to what you said about the teacher and the student.
Yeah.
It's the most important connection.
Yeah.
And yet, in the system for education, it's the least people that we list.
yeah, they can't change the curriculum. They can't do anything they
I
need to.
mean,
Yeah.
well, yeah, I mean,
We won't
it's
go
a long debate, but
Yeah, it is a
yeah,
long debate.
in short, yes,
Yeah.
they can't make it. It's not them creating the system.
Yeah.
And here, what is interesting with this case study is that we hear a lot about people, even educated people today who are losing a sense of purpose in their job and things like that. And these who are the people who probably are the ones who do the thing that you need to feel like a real purpose, because you don't clean old people or you don't care about old people if you don't have a strong sense of purpose. And they lost the sense of purpose because of all the organization and the metrics and the decision, like the school that we just talked about before. So this system is great because it brings back the purpose, and they start with that. They say the purpose is to have people living
Meaningful lives.
meaningful,
Yeah,
autonomous
yeah.
lives.
Both for the staff as well as for the families, right? And the elderly that they're
So-
serving.
So that's the thing, that they start from the core connection, like you said, and they bring back autonomy and the ability to take a decision.
And one of the interesting things that is not in the video is that Jos himself is a nurse. And he and his wife started the organization because they felt that sense of lack of motivation in their job. They felt that sense of fragmentation, that they couldn't actually solve the problems of their clients. It was extremely demotivating. And so they actually left the official system and created Bertzorg. So in fact, it came from a nurse themselves to actually create this system in the way that they felt was best
They
serving them.
reown the system in a way.
Yeah, reclaiming.
Reclaim,
Yeah,
yeah.
reclaiming.
Yeah, am I correct to understand that they take on nurses who have already been trained and are qualified nurses? So my understanding is that a lot of people have skills, hard skills, and they are very good. But when you talk about leadership and managerial skills and those soft skills, that ability that obviously INSEAD puts so much emphasis on through OB and that kind of thing, that's a lot of people take it for granted, but effectively it's what is missing in a lot of the workforce, especially the junior workforce that hasn't learned how to manage people and manage themselves. And so from my understanding, those 20 development professionals, as well as, having gone through a development course yourself, you're able to guide people. And so my understanding is that there's this guidance, teaching how to manage yourself, how to manage others, is what they're lacking, and that's how they became successful, by teaching them that and becoming autonomous, self-sufficient, and then they can go off on their own. But effectively, they're jumping from a place of having the skills already. That I think is core to the success of this.
The organization realizes that oftentimes those groups might come to a point where they can't make a decision themselves, but rather than send in a manager to give them a protocol, they have coaches that come in, and those coaches are trained not to deliver answers, but rather to facilitate a process so that that group can come to an answer.
If I may, just from the people who are online, we have Pam who's online, and she says, I'm a nurse educator. Nurses are losing their capacity to think critically and holistically because system KPI are task oriented, and that is the big problem. And I have a question. We have a question from Aude, who's asking about how wages are determined in this model. Are they determined at the central level through a principle of equity, or how does that work? How are people paid?
It's a great question, and I actually don't know the answer to exactly how the wages are set, but I do know that these nurses are paid higher than nurses in the public system. So in fact, although their wage costs are higher because of the lower managerial costs, in fact, the overall system is lower cost per outcome. So I don't know that question exactly, but it's a really interesting one. Curious to know the answer to that too. I'm conscious of time, and we actually would like to just kind of expand the conversation to show you that there are a number of organizations that we met that were operating in this way, all within different contexts and different issue areas. For example, in Cultivate Collectives here, we had 2 organizations, Our Labs, which works in youth development through technology entrepreneurship, Mothers to Mothers, shown here, which positions mothers living with HIV as caregivers and as promoters of health within the public health system. The second you can see here, Equip Problem Solvers. This is Bertzorg. We also have an organization there called Family Independence Initiative, an organization which positions families themselves as decision makers in their path out of poverty. Promote Platforms, the organization focused here or shown here is Slum Dwellers International. This is an organization that covers 30
cities in the world.
500 cities, 14 million shack dwellers across the globe, all of whom are working within their communities to promote better housing, to eliminate forced evictions, and to be able to upgrade their homes, often through savings schemes and loan schemes that they're able to generate themselves. The other organization in Promote Platforms was Children Youth Finance, an organization that was promoting children as economic citizens and working within financial systems and banking systems in order to promote child-friendly banking. And then lastly, Disrupt Policies and Patterns. The organization focused here is Fundación Escuela Nueva, based in Colombia, but working throughout South America and in fact around the world to have teacher-led classrooms and promoting a curriculum that really fosters that sense of active learning in the classroom, as well as another organization, NIDAM, based in Bihar in India, that works with informal workers across the country to promote safe livelihoods, income generation, a number of different schemes to actually try and ensure that informal workers themselves gain legitimacy and have platforms for income generation for their families. So each of these organizations extremely different, but all of them have these principles as their guiding force and put primary actors at the heart of all of their activities. And we were simply lucky enough to be able to spend time with them, to be able to see these patterns across all of these organizations. We know that there are many, many more that are working across the world to do this.
One of the questions we get is, okay, isn't this just, a bunch of kind of small scale projects? How is this really creating systemic change? We've gone into the very micro, the strategy, the practices, the tactics, some business models that are there. What was kind of clearly evident, all of those organizations, these are models that have been adopted in multiple countries in the world. Bertzorg, I think 35 countries, Mothers to Mothers, 10 countries, SDI, 35 plus countries. But also, for example, the work in NIDAM started to work with informal workers across the whole of India, built a national movement. Everything was something between a social enterprise, spun off 30 organizations, a labor union movement, an activist organization, and ultimately created the first Informality Act in the world around street vendors in India, where 90% of the workforce is around the informal economy with no rights for workers. So these very, very small acts and processes help to build larger movements for change that ultimately changed policies, changed the way that different actors work, changed the way that systems were financed. And so that was kind of a really interesting reflection for us that actually small change, creates big change. In fact, I think our main thesis was if we really want transformative and inclusive changes and more sustainable changes, we need to have practices working in these ways.
So just to conclude, I know we're right at time here, but I think one of the things that we saw, particularly in the pandemic, as we were actually finishing the manuscript, was that in times of urgency, we do tend to look for the big time heroes, for the people who will come in and make the policy and make the decisions that are going to help all of us. But in fact, those heroes and technological solutions are not going to be the way to sustainably drive change, that rather, because these big complex problems have power and inequity at the heart of them, we need to actually focus just as much on the who of change, the process of change, how we do it, not just itself the change, not just the change itself, not just the solution, but the way to get there. I know that we wanted to open it up for questions, but we're right at time.
But I think we can take a few
Take
minutes
one
for
or two,
questions if
yeah.
anybody has them. I actually have one while people are warming up. Is there a risk then to put all the responsibility to people and then disengage at a societal level, at a public and collective level for any kind of responsibility with this approach?
No, but I think it is a process of thinking about what power we have and what we need to give away, right? And so, I mean, I think the message here is in all of, because now it isn't just social change organization or the UN running social change. We have large businesses in the world, talking about the change that they can create in the world, right? And so it is about kind of what are we learning from these kinds of organizations? What are the tactics that include not only the voice of people, but actually getting to the point of distributing the way that change happens that allows other people to really be participating and making decisions in the way that, we've equipped those nurses. Right? So it clearly is not about, just saying, well, someone else needs to be creating, making the decisions. It's clear that many of us in this room and the places we work, and we will go on to work, we will be in positions of power, right? We will have resources at our disposal, right? The question is, how do other people start to take part in that in ways that go beyond, I think all the traditions, of participation. I mean, let's also come back to the world vision question and hear a little bit around, your thoughts around where you started, having heard this.
I mean, for me, what is unclear to me is what is the incentive of those people in power, of those systems we're going to change? Because I think if you open any UN report or like whatever, any big corporate policy, of course, they're talking about putting the people at the heart of the change. Like that's, again, really not new. And then it's very easy, of course, to talk about system change and then think with system change the devil's in the detail. And it's like, okay, so how are you gonna operationalize this? And that is maybe a very
but I think this is what we set out to do. We had, I think, the same frustration as you did, right? So it's like, okay, well, what's the how? What are the actual practices that make that happen? I think, what we want to serve up here is a few examples of actually having seen it happen in ways that really do put people at the heart of some of that decision making, and it isn't just lip service. But you're absolutely right. What are the incentives now? I think there is increasingly, commitments being made, and now we need to start delivering on some of those commitments. I think there is a growing body of both in philanthropy, but also certainly now in companies to say, we really need to understand how people are participating in ways that are different. And I think with the power, what we haven't really spoken about is with the power of technology. So many of these organizations, are empowered by technology. And I was telling Adele, I had a company come and actually say, well, how do we start to adopt some of this in our kind of corporate strategy? Because through technology, as a technology company, how can through technology actually able to empower people to take on some of the decision making, and how can their technology actually do that?
Yeah.
So,
and also an assumption you're making is that people want to change. But I think, for example, INSEAD,
sure.
What's the background of everyone, right? Like finance, consulting, like this is not a social business or business school, whatever. And I think we're all very comfortable living like that.
That's not necessarily true.
No, of course.
I think there's a number of different reasons why people would choose to change. I think in each of these stories, there were examples of power dynamics that had to shift in order for those broader changes to happen. In some cases, they were very willing participants in the transfer of power and that sharing of power. In other cases, they had to be forced to do that change. Either it was in self-interest. In the case of Nidan, the politicians did not want to pass the bill for informal workers to have rights. But in fact, it got to the point where there was so much unrest in the country that they had to finally make that decision. Now it comes to the point of how do they implement it? And they're in a very interesting stage where local informal workers are sitting on committees with other people in positions of power and actually trying to share power together. So I think sometimes it's self-interest, sometimes it is altruistic, and in other times it's just we are all, in the case of climate change, we're all on this plane together. And if we want to make it to our destination, we are going to have to make different decisions, and we can't just do it the way, it's not just business as usual.
Say, I think that it's important to put things back into context. I think, as you mentioned earlier, like it's not a one size fits all, right? As to who enacts the change, I think that goes also to that point. I'm thinking about there's a film about Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the States on the basis of sex, it's called. And during that film, it's about a case that she brings to court where she talks about changing anti-discrimination laws against women. And the case is actually based on an anti-discrimination law where the discrimination was against a man. And that's what changed everything. And in that film, she says, I'm not trying to get you to change society. Society has already changed. Law is reacting, and we are just trying to reflect society. So in this context where the US, where everything was quite, the system was there, a change had already occurred. And what we were pushing for at the time was for the change of the change in legislation to reflect the changes that had already occurred in society. Now, that was in the US where you have a very clear system that had already been a precedent, common law, all that kind of thing. So that's fine. But then you have other systems where, for example, Japan, the 1960s, you are going to have, laws going to come into place because the system is not in place. They have to put everything into place. They have just been destroyed by the war. They're rebuilding, and you have lots of stuff that needs moving. And so you're going to have a top-down approach. And that's really useful. But putting things into context tells you how can we implement change. Sometimes it's going to come from the bottom. Sometimes it's going to come from the top. And you're going to have to look at the specifics.
We absolutely saw that, this iteration between the patterns of behavior and the policies kind of going back and forth. In every context, it was different. And in fact, it was the primary actors who were able to read the context, to make decisions, and then be able to drive change forward. And in that case, change that was actually going to work for those who needed it the most.
We're gonna have to wrap it up. Thank you so much for joining us, for the teaser about the book. I think again, I don't do promotions of things typically, but I think what's interesting here is that it doesn't provide the playbook.
We were actually advised, write the playbook.
Yes, so it's not a playbook that we will typically have in this kind of books. There are many, particularly in the development world, there are many. I think what's interesting here, what I find the most interesting here were the cases that are quite inspiring in terms of looking at things differently. And in particular, the change of power dynamics in all of the cases, which I think is important. I wanted to ask, because we have here students who will be in position of power when they leave the school, wherever they go, if you have some final recommendations or piece of advice you want to share as we wrap up, and so you have the last word. You're going to have something beyond read our book.
Well, maybe when I first left graduate school, you see things you want to change, but you're not necessarily in the position of power first. So maybe before you get into what you think is fully power, you don't have to wait. No matter where you are in an organization, you can, create those kinds of changes. I think that's the first one as a personal thing, is discovering one's own personal agency, which is separate from your position, right? So I think that's at least my own personal lesson. And then I think the responsibility, of privilege, it's now kind of out there that we kind of talk about privilege in a way that is more explicit. And I think it's, something that I think we have to learn is, something that isn't only for us, right? And you spoke about the plane, to come back to that analogy. And so, you know, in a way, we're already powerful and successful just by the fact that we're sitting in this room. I don't know any of your backgrounds, and some of you may have had very long trajectories to get here. Maybe others, you know, this was clearer in your journeys. But I think once you're here, you're probably sitting in premium economy or business already, right? So it's about thinking, what do we do with that, right? And probably we're going to be okay if we're in that. And, you know, if you're in the front of the plane, even if the plane crashes, you probably have, you know, well, actually, no, if you're in the back of the plane, you've got a better chance of survival. That metaphor's not working anymore.
I was about to say, I think we're
So
taking.
maybe you've got the life jacket.
Cynthia?
Yeah, just, I mean, for me, as I said, I came to a point in my journey where I got very scared. And after this journey, I came back very inspired. I feel to me, if I can spend the rest of my life supporting organizations that promote these practices in the world, become a supporting actor alongside these organizations, alongside primary actors, then that is a life well spent, and it's a good use for a business education.
Thank you very much. Thanks to our active people for thinking as well, and François and Cynthia are here to sign the book if you want. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks
Thank
and
you.
bye. Thanks. Bye, everybody.